Somewhere on a French island in the South Pacific, a crow just bent a piece of wire into a hook. No training, no demonstration. It just figured it out. Researchers watched it happen and their jaws hit the floor because most 8-year-old kids can't solve that puzzle on the first try, and this bird did it in under a minute. Now fly 6,000 miles to a lab in Massachusetts, where a completely different bird spent 30 years learning to count, name colors, and grasp the number 0. 2 birds, 0 hands. 2 totally different kinds of genius. So today we're putting both of them through the actual tests scientists use to measure a 5-year-old's mind, and by the end, you'll know exactly which bird wins and why the answer isn't the one you're expecting. Let's start with the crow, because its species has a superpower most birds don't bother with. The New Caledonian crow has no fingers, so over thousands of years it evolved the next best thing: a beak shaped like a multi-tool and a brain built to use it. In the wild, these crows strip leaves into hooked tools to fish grubs out of tree bark. Some of them even carve a stepped, saw-toothed edge into the tool so the barbs catch better on the way out. That's not spider spins a web instinct. That's manufacturing, on purpose, for a specific job. But wild tool use is one thing. Scientists wanted to know something harder. Can a crow invent a brand new solution to a brand new problem on the spot? Enter Betty. In 2002, researchers at Oxford gave Betty and another crow, named Abel, a simple puzzle. A tiny bucket of food, sitting at the bottom of a clear tube, too deep to reach with a beak. They left out 2 tools, one straight wire, and one already bent into a hook. Abel, being the bigger bird, just grabbed the hook and left. So Betty was stuck with a useless straight wire. And then she did something no one had ever filmed an animal doing before. She wedged one end of the wire under a piece of tape, pulled the other end with her beak, and bent herself a hook. Then she fished out the bucket like it was nothing. Researchers called it some of the strongest evidence of pure, on-the-spot invention ever recorded outside of humans. Here's what that actually means. When scientists later gave that same hook puzzle to human children, most of them didn't solve it reliably until around age 8. One bird, one afternoon, no instructions, and she'd already out-engineered most 8-year-olds. Hold on to that. We're coming back to Betty. Now let's meet the other contestant. In 1977, a researcher named Irene Pepperberg walked into a pet store in Chicago and asked an employee to pick out a parrot completely at random. She didn't want anyone accusing her later of cherry-picking a gifted bird. The employee grabbed a 1-year-old African gray. She named him Alex. At the time, the entire scientific field agreed on one thing. Bird brains are called bird brains for a reason. Wired for instinct, not thought. Pepperberg spent the next 30 years quietly proving that consensus wrong. And she didn't do it by teaching Alex to mimic sounds like a tape recorder. She taught him to use words as labels, the same way a toddler learns that red means the color, not just a noise that gets you a cracker. By the end, Alex could identify 50 different objects, 7 colors, and 5 shapes, and count quantities up to 6. He could look at a tray of mixed items and answer a question he'd never been asked before, like how many blue blocks, by combining categories he'd learned separately. And then, in 2005, came the moment that actually stunned the scientific world. Researchers showed Alex 2 sets of objects and asked him what was different between them. When there was no difference at all, Alex started answering on his own with a word nobody had taught him for this: none. He had grasped the concept of 0, an abstract idea that human children don't typically reach until around age 4. For context, it took human civilization thousands of years of counting before anyone formalized 0 as a number at all. Alex picked it up in a research lab in Massachusetts. So right now, the scorecard looks lopsided. The crow looks like a spontaneous genius. The parrot looks like a 30-year straight-A student. But here's the part that never makes it into the viral crow clips. Years after Betty's famous hook, researchers went back out into the wild and tested crows who had never been in a lab and never seen a human hand hold a hook. 10 out of 18 of them bent their twigs into hooks too, on their own, with no training, in the middle of the forest. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Was Betty inventing a tool on the spot, or just doing something her species already does at home? One scientist involved in the follow-up put it bluntly, maybe Betty wasn't a genius. Maybe, in his words, she was a little robot just following a natural behavioral routine. That doesn't erase what Betty did. Solving a brand new puzzle with a brand new material on the very first try is still genuinely impressive. But it does mean her big invention might have come with a head start built into her genes before she ever saw that lab. Now compare that to Alex's zero test, which ran under strict conditions specifically designed to rule out him just picking up hidden cues from his own trainer. His results held up. So, in the boring metric that scientists actually care about most, how solid is the evidence, the parrot's genius is standing on much firmer ground than the crow's. There's one more matchup worth mentioning, because it's the closest thing to an apples-to-apples exam. In a separate study, both crows and human children were given a version of Aesop's fable about the thirsty crow, drop stones into a tube of water to raise the level and grab a floating treat. The crows solved it, dropping solid objects instead of hollow ones, sinking objects instead of floating ones, showing an understanding of cause and effect that matched children roughly 5 to 7 years old. But when researchers made the puzzle just slightly trickier, the crows started failing in ways 5-year-old kids didn't, which suggests the crows were running on very smart rules of thumb, not a deep understanding of why the water was actually rising. So on raw, fast, under-pressure problem-solving, crow, arguably even with a kindergartner, on understanding the actual why behind the trick, the 5-year-old pulls ahead. So who actually wins? If you're grading pure, jaw-dropping, unscripted problem-solving, the crow's hook is still one of the most stunning single moments ever caught in animal cognition, asterisk and all. But if you're grading something closer to an actual 5-year-old's report card, language, counting, abstract concepts, holding up for 30 years instead of one afternoon, the parrot wins, and it isn't close. In fact, Alex's own researcher put a real number on it herself. She said his intellect operated at roughly the level of a 5-year-old child, with the emotional maturity of a 2-year-old, which means the title of this video isn't clickbait. A scientist said it first. But honestly, picking a winner kind of misses the point. We built the 5-year-old test for 5-year-old humans. A crow doesn't need to understand why water rises. It needs to get a grub out of a tree before winter. And it is spectacular at exactly that. A parrot doesn't need to invent a hook. It needs to hold its place in a flock where the smartest, most social bird gets fed. And Alex was built for exactly that. Neither one of them is failing to be human. They're both acing tests we never even designed for them, with a brain the size of a walnut and 0 fingers between them. That's the actual shock here, not which bird wins. How close either of them gets to us at all. On branches of the family tree that split off millions of years before either species existed. There's one more thing you should know, and I saved it for last on purpose. On the last night of his life, in September of 2007, Pepperberg said goodnight to Alex the same way she had for 30 years. "You be good," she told him. "I love you. I'll see you tomorrow." And Alex said it back in his own voice, "You'll be in tomorrow." He died overnight, of natural causes, at 31 years old. Nobody knows if he understood what tomorrow meant that particular night, but he said, "I love you anyway." Now that's a bird I'd put my money on. If you want to see what a crow's brain actually looks like sitting next to a chimpanzee's, that video's right here. Subscribe, because these birds are just getting started.